Welcome to High Performance.
Pleasure.
I want to start with a question. I've heard you talk about the power of it in the past. And the question is, tell me who you are. So when I say to you, tell me who you are, what do you think?
Well, the only right answer I know to that question is that the question is much more important than the answer. Because any answer I give you would be limiting. I mean, I could say I'm a doctor, I'm a writer, I'm a husband, I'm a father. I mean, any of those are only aspects of who I am. So I'm just a person who's sitting here now hanging out with your question. That's who I am.
And why is that such an important question?
Because who we believe we are determines so much of our behavior and our reactions and perceptions and interactions. You know, whether it's in personal relationships, whether it's in politics and so on. So if I'm comfortable not having a definitive answer and just being with whatever is happening at the moment, then I'm in the present. But as soon as I define myself by any one of the categories of my existence, I'm limiting myself to that category, and that's going to limit my reactions. So, you know, we were talking about sports before. You know, if you define yourself as, say, a Manchester City fan, if that's who you are, that's going to determine a whole lot of your reactions, and you won't appreciate a lot of things that you might really appreciate if you didn't have that narrow definition of yourself. And in this culture, it's very much about, you know, tell me who you are. Well, I'm a doctor, I'm a plumber. I mean, you know, that's not who you are. That's just what you do, you know. So but live in a society that limits us through all these categories. I think it's one of the sins of civilization.
So one of your most famous concepts, Gabor, is around wholeness.
Yeah.
And how do we all develop this sense of wholeness? What are your tips on how we can do that then?
Well, actually, it's more like how we lose it in the first place. Because I don't know if you guys are parents, but there's no one-day-old baby that likes wholeness. They're completely themselves. Whatever they experience, you're going to know about it. Whatever they feel, they're going to manifest it. Whatever is in them to communicate, they're going to communicate it. So it's more a question of how do we lose that wholeness. And the English language is interesting that way because the word health itself derives from an Anglo-Saxon word for wholeness. And wholeness is the natural state of any creature. You know, no animal loses wholeness in their healthy environment. So the more fundamental question is not how do we get to wholeness, but how do we lose it? Understanding that can help us get back to it.
So how do we lose it?
One of the needs of the child, we can talk about human needs and as defined by evolution, not by some arbitrary New Age conceptual framework, but just evolution. And so you might say that one need that we have, without which we couldn't live, is oxygen. Because we evolved in an oxygen-filled environment. If there was no oxygen, we wouldn't exist. So you might say oxygen is an expectation. It's a need that we have. We also have emotional needs and expectations wired into us by evolution. One of them is to be seen for who we are, to be accepted for who we are. That's just a need of the child. If that need is met, that child develops a sense of complete comfort with who they are and presence and wholeness. However, in our society, and as a parent, I can certainly say this, it's so difficult for parents to really see their kids for who they actually are without projecting our expectations on them for who they should be or how they should be, how they should show up, how they should behave. And so that we're not seeing the child for themselves, we're seeing the child through our own expectations and anxieties. Or the child who's not seen for who they are, they don't see themselves. So they lose their connection to themselves. That's just how it works.
It seems such a hard thing, right, to get parenting right.
Do you know that famous poem by the British poet Philip Larkin about...
Our parents fuck us up.
Yeah. they fuck you up, your mom and dad do not mean to what they do, but they do not mean to what they do. Look, parenting has become far more complex and difficult than nature intended it. I just finished, there's a lot of research and literature on how Aboriginal tribal peoples parent their kids, much more healthy ways than we do today. And I just finished reading a book published maybe 40 years ago now called The Continuum Concept. It's an American model and writer who ends up in the Venezuelan jungle, 6 weeks away from civilization, with these Stone Age people. And these people, they hold their kids all the time. They don't put them down to sleep in a different room. They don't let them cry. Not that they forbid them to cry. The child doesn't have to cry to be picked up because the parents are with them all the time. And they don't judge and they don't berate, they don't punish their kids. And these kids grow up with an innate sense of their own goodness and their own wholeness. And of course, it's not, the parenting task is not forced upon isolated individual parents who both have to go to work and not see their kids the whole day. The kids are with the parents the whole day, and not just with their parents, other adults, other parenting figures. It takes a village, as the African saying goes. Now, kids who grow up like that, they have a sense of their goodness, confidence in their bodies, connection to their environment, and a very positive sense of themselves. So, civilization, for all its advantages, of course, we can't go back to being Stone Age tribal peoples, but we've lost so much. And if only we could understand what we've lost and do what we can in today's society to bring back as much as we can. So that, civilization, of course, all these achievements, scientific, technical, medical, cultural, whatever, but we've lost the plot when it comes to kids. And parents should need a lot more support. Parenting should be much more multi-generational, much more communal. Parents should be supported to be at home with their kids in the first months, for sure. Kindergartens and so on shouldn't be just about behavior and teaching of facts or skills. It should be about relationship, because human beings are relational creatures by nature. So we could do a whole lot better, and it's not up to individual parents. It's a real social question.
Look, we all know the struggle of deciding what to eat, but what if I told you that Huel can make that decision easier? Their Taster Bundle has got 8 ready-to-drink bottles, including their Black Edition, which has got 35 grams of protein, 6 daily A to Z vitamins, 8 complete nutrition bars, 2 hot savoury pots, and a free Huel t-shirt. All you have to do is click the link in the description to unlock your offer now at huel.com/highperformance. And what have you learned then about how we ended up in this modern way of thinking about parenting, where you put your kids in a room and you close the door and let them cry until they don't cry anymore?
Yeah.
You go back to work as quickly as possible to show your kids what a work ethic looks like. You put your kids in full-time nursery as early as you can so you can get on with the life that you wanted to live as a parent. How have we ended up in this way of thinking?
Yeah, because we live in a society whose implicit but even overtly stated value is individual advancement and individual success. And as soon as we put the emphasis on the individual, we forget that we're relational creatures. So when you go back to work early to show your kids a work ethic, what you're really showing is that you don't care about them. Because if you care, I'm talking about myself. When I was a young physician, I was really a workaholic, and what really mattered to me as being successful in practice. What message did my kids get? Is that they didn't matter to me, because if they mattered to me, I would have been there with them on the weekends and in the evenings rather than being on call all the time. So inadvertently, we give our kids the message that they don't matter. And when we don't pick them up, why do kids cry? Kids are wired for connection with the parents. They're literally wired, their brains are wired for it. Not just our kids, birds, mammals. There's physiological, neurological wiring for connection. We're also wired for panic. We're actually wired for panic. Why are we wired for panic? Because what should I feel as an infant if my parents are not around? I should feel panic. Because what do I do if I feel panic? I cry. What does that crying do? It immediately should bring the parent running to pick me up, who shouldn't have put me down in the first place, not according to how ancient people's. Okay, now, what happens to a kid where they're having this panic, they're crying for the parent because they physically need the contact emotionally, and their parent ignores it? The panic is wired into the brain. And now you have a kid who's going to be anxious all their lives. So again, if we just understood the basic needs of kids, and like, you're a parent?
Yeah.
Okay. When I was a young parent, if you had asked me what is the greatest value to me, I would have unhesitatingly, I would have said the well-being and happiness of my family. And you'd probably say the same thing.
Correct, yeah.
But if you actually looked at how I lived my life, that's not what you would have concluded. What you would have concluded is that this guy's highest value is advancement at work,
Yeah.
and his success as a physician. So that my declared value, which I would have been very sincere about articulating, was the complete odds with the value that I was actually living. So my kids get, what message do they get? You know?
And what about people who listen to this and go, well, I need to work all the hours God sends to pay the bills, to...
That's certainly true for a lot of people. Partly that's a matter of how this society doesn't value young life. And we keep talking about how children are our future, but we sure don't behave that way. But given that this society is like that, then at least you should realize what the kid is losing by your absence. And when you're with them, really be with them. Don't spend your time looking at your cell phone, watching television, vegging out on the latest football talk show. You know, spend time with your kids, be with them, and invite them to be in your presence. So at least we should do what we can to compensate for what we've lost.
I think in your writing, Gabor, especially your new book, The Myth of Normal,
Yeah.
you pose some quite searching questions for the reader or the listener to ask themselves. And I think one of the most effective set of questions I've read from your work is the compassionate inquiry questions
Yeah.
that I think move us all closer to this sense of being who we should be.
Yeah.
Would you explain about compassionate inquiry and why anyone can use it to their advantage?
Sure. So it goes back to when I was a family physician, and I began to notice that who got sick and who didn't wasn't accidental. That certain characteristics or character traits were showing up more and more frequently in the people who got chronically ill. And those character traits, suppressing emotions and being too nice to always please other people, just to give two examples, nobody's born with it. So these were traits developed in childhood in response to certain experiences, which meant now that self-suppression of emotions and being too nice and taking on too much stress in order not to trouble others stress the body. They lead to inflammation and illness. In other words, the physical illnesses that people were coming in to my office with weren't just bodily phenomena, they represented emotional dynamics and how they lived their lives, which also meant that if somebody comes into me with an inflamed joint, I may have to give them an anti-inflammatory, I may have to give them a steroid, I may have to give them a medication to suppress their immune system, which is attacking their own body. But if I really was going to deal with it, I would also have to say, what's stressing you so much? Are you saying no? Do you know how to say no when the world is demanding too much from you? Do you express how you feel? Which means it wasn't enough just to write a prescription. I'd have to talk with them. And now where I was working in that part of Vancouver, people couldn't afford private psychologists. And the psychiatrists who are medical doctors who were covered by the medical plan, they're not trained to ask these questions. Mostly they know how to prescribe medications. I don't mean to slander a whole profession, but mostly that's how they're trained, which means I had to talk to my patients. So I learned how to listen. So then I had to learn to develop certain questions. And that's how compassionate inquiry arose, is just for my own. Now also, I had to deal with my own neuroses, my own dysfunctions, my own workaholism, my own depression, my own problems with my kids. So I just learned to ask certain questions. And then since then, I'm not going to go into the long detail, but compassionate inquiry has become a therapeutic modality that we teach to thousands of therapists internationally. And it's also, I write about in the book. And there's some certain basic questions. And I do believe that we all carry the truth within ourselves. We may not have access to the truth all the time. I certainly don't. But ask the right questions, we'll find the truth in ourselves. So that's what it's based on.
I think it'd be really helpful for people if Damien and I ran through the 6 questions, and you can just explain why they are important questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
And then, people can note them down and they can do this themselves at home. So the first question in your compassionate inquiry is, in my life's important areas, what am I not saying no to?
Yeah. So compassionate, that's an example of compassionate inquiry. It's doesn't encompass the whole thing. But I've mentioned this before. There was a book written by an Australian palliative care nurse about 12 years ago. It's called The Top 5 Regrets of Dying People. Now, I used to work in palliative care myself. I looked after terminally ill people. But she would sit with these people who were dying before their time because of malignancy, and she would, get to know them. And the top regret was that I wasn't myself, that I didn't have the courage to be myself. I spent too much time trying to please others rather than, so that's what I found as well, is that people didn't know how to say no to other people's demands, were suppressing themselves for the sake of being accepted by others. So therefore, this question, in important areas of your life, either in personal existence or in your work activities, where do you have trouble saying no? If I ask you guys, does anything come up? Do you have trouble saying no?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's a real issue for me.
Okay, so would it be, I'm not asking for details, but
Sure.
Work or personal life, or both?
Both.
Okay, all right. So then the next question follows, which is what is the impact on you of your difficulty saying no?
It's often sort of leading myself to physical and mental exhaustion.
Exactly. Now, are you both parents?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the word that the kids start saying automatically at age 1.5? No.
No. Yeah.
Time to put your shoes on. No.
Yeah, you're right.
Now, why is that? Because nature is smart. And nature knows that we have to develop a barrier behind which we can develop our own will and our own preferences. So that no, that the child says automatically at that age, is their little fence behind which they can develop their own sense of self and their own will. If we don't crush it, a lot of people think now they have a monster on their hands, they have to crush it. So now we have people that don't know how to say no. So the impact is exhaustion, fatigue.
Yep.
It could be frequent colds, could even be serious illness. So it's an important little thing that you're not saying there. So that's the first. The second question is, what is the impact? So I'm saying to people, identify where you're not saying no, write down the impact. This week, where did I not say no? What was the impact? I was resentful, I was tired, I had trouble sleeping, I got a cold, whatever it was. The third question is, what is the belief behind your inability to say no? So, in your case, Damien, what's the belief there? If I say no, what does that mean?
That people will reject me, people won't like me for saying no.
Exactly. So that if I say no, I'll be rejected. That's one story that people say. Now, let's turn it around. If you called me up to go for coffee, and I was up all night with a sick patient or somebody, and I said, no, I'm sorry, Damien, but I'm not going to go to coffee with you. Would you reject me?
The opposite, yeah.
Exactly. But you're afraid that you'd be rejected, which tells me something about your childhood, is that you got a certain message that you're only acceptable when you're compliant. And then you internalize that, and that becomes part of your personality. It's not who you are. It's just how you're programmed. So the belief is, if I say no, I'll be rejected. Okay, now the next question is, where did I learn that? And then we can go into your life. And and the fifth question is, who would you be without that belief? If you didn't have the belief that if I say no, I'd be rejected, who would you be? What's the answer?
Myself.
You'd be yourself. You'd be free.
Yeah.
And then there's the sixth question, which is certainly was true for me for a long time. Are there areas in your life where you're not saying yes, where you want to say yes, but you're not saying it? Maybe some passion, some desire for self-expression, some desire to be out in nature or go hiking or, I don't know, play sports or dance or write or draw or play music. Or are there areas in your life where you're not saying yes, but there's a yes that wants to be said? And that yes that you're not saying is as impactful negatively as the no that you're not saying. Is this clear to you guys?
Yeah.
It's really clear.
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
There's two questions that spin off from this, Gabor, I'd like to explore. One is quite a pragmatic question of how do we learn to say no better then?
First of all, by doing this exercise.
Yeah.
Like if you actually get the impact,
Yeah.
if you really think about it, you realize how important it is. Secondly, if you realize that you'd be free, that's worth something. So basically, it's just by noticing, not by judging yourself, but by noticing where you have trouble saying no, what the impact is, and that it's just a story that you're telling yourself. Now, it's true. There might be some people in your life that if you said no to them, they'd reject you. That might be true because you've trained them. You've trained them that you're the guy who doesn't say no. That's what they signed up for. And all of a sudden you start saying no. Say, oh, this is not what I don't want. But then you have a decision to make. Who would you rather please, them or yourself? And I can also tell you, the people that really cared about you and really loved you, they'd welcome it. They'd say, it's about time. So it's not that you lose anything in the end. You'd find out who your friends were.
Yeah.
But the people that reject you when you say no, in order to honor yourself, they were not your friends in the first place. Were they?
True, yeah.
Yeah.
Which leads to my second question of how do we ask these questions? Is it better to we ask ourselves, or do we have somebody that can help us and guide us through this inquiry?
You can do it both ways, but in the book Myth and Normal, we set it up as a self-conducted exercise. Sit down with these questions once a week. Write them out. Don't just run through them in your head. Take a piece of paper, not even a computer, but handwritten. Where this week did I not say no? What was the impact of me not saying no? It takes 10 minutes once a week. What was the impact? What was the belief? If you do this regularly, people have told me that that exercise alone has changed their lives if they do it regularly. It's not that difficult.
I noticed that you leaned straight into Damien, the presenter, right, asking lots of questions to Gabor when he was doing that bit of work with you. Let me just ask you how it felt, because when Gabor said, people would say, it's about time. You can finally be yourself. Even I felt a weight lift from me, and I'm not even you. And the truth is, Gabor, we've worked together now for 5 years.
Really?
We've had a conversation about Damien's overwhelm and saying yes to everything monthly for those 5 years. So what were you thinking when you were talking?
I had my my wife's face in the head, that idea of at last. That it was her words saying what was coming out of your mouth. Because it's a frequent area of contention. So the freedom of, in terms of in my personal life, of where conflicts will often arise is because I've committed to something.
Yeah.
Because the fear of saying no.
Well, do you know something? It was here in London, I think 6 years ago now, 5 or 6. I was here for a speaking engagement, and my wife was here with me. And it was a crazy busy, I was overworking, and she said to me, Buddy, you've written a book called When the Body Says No. That's one of my books, When the Body Says No. And she says, no, you better write one called When the Wife Says No. Because she wasn't going to put up with it anymore.
Yeah.
You know? And partly I had a decision to make. Do I bring my life in alignment with what I teach? Or do I present one nice message on stage and live a totally different life, you know, in my personal existence? And it's an ongoing theme.
See, but what I take real heart from that, Gabor, is that if you don't mind me referencing, you're 80 now.
Yeah.
And yet this is still a process that you're asking yourself this question.
Yeah.
You know, at your age, like nobody has it figured, I suppose, is what I take some kind of solace from. When did you start asking yourself these questions? What happened for you to ask yourself these questions?
What happened for me, that life wasn't working. In my 40s, I was alienated and depressed, and I was successful, but I wasn't a happy camper, you know, and there were problems in my relationship. I didn't like the way things were going with my kids, so I was challenged personally. And, you know, I had to wake up and start dealing with it. And it's an ongoing process. I often say this, that, I'm 80 years old now, and I'm glad I'm not as young and stupid as I was when I was 79, you know? So there's hope for you guys too.
You know what, I'm really glad you're sharing this, is because a lot of people say the same thing to me when I meet them, which is, you know, this show is called High Performance, right?
Yeah.
And they often say to me, you know, everything in my life is great.
Yeah.
But I'm still searching for something.
Yeah.
Which is why I come and listen to your show. And I think that what you've just described there is someone who was outwardly hugely successful, inwardly was still searching.
Well, they're searching for themselves. Whether they know that or not, that's what they're searching for. They're searching for their truth. And this society reveres and rewards and valorizes external success. But all three of us know how many highly successful people, in that conventional sense, are totally miserable inside. I mean, totally miserable. You can see it.
See, I would say 60 or 70% of the people that sit across from us on this show are struggling quite heavily with life, despite the fact they've been invited onto a show called High Performance. Right?
Yeah.
And I think so often it's a self-esteem issue.
Yeah.
What would you like to share with our audience about self-esteem?
There's two kinds of self-esteem, you might say. There's what we can call contingent self-esteem, which depends on how well you do and what other people think of you. Then there's genuine self-esteem, which says, I'm not worthwhile because I can do this, that, or the other. I'm worthwhile whether or not I can do this, that, or the other. Now, the people that you're talking about are very much caught in that contingent self-esteem, that how they feel about themselves depends on how they perform and how they're perceived to perform by other people. But underneath that, there's a hole, and it can never be filled from the outside. But that's what they keep trying to do. So the more successful they are, the more success they need. I know that feeling, oh great, my book is a bestseller this week. But what about next week when it isn't? Then who am I? And so this society values, valorizes, and touts that contingent self-esteem. And we do it in school to kids. We do it in kindergarten to kids. And we don't understand that intrinsic, non-contingent self-esteem that has nothing to do with looks, achievement, or external approbation.
How are we creating an environment of contingent self-esteem with our children?
Well, by demanding that, by getting the kids the message that they're only acceptable to you if they behave a certain way.
Or get success at school.
That they have to have success, and if there's success, you're so happy, and otherwise you're not. By not seeing them, by not accepting their vulnerability, but by demanding that they be tough or resilient, by constantly evaluating them in schools. Schools Schools are constantly evaluating kids. Now, I can show you the studies. There's such a thing called evaluation stress. You can do experiments with adults where they're being evaluated and their stress hormone levels, even when it doesn't matter, even if they know it's only an experiment, and you measure their stress hormone levels, they're elevated for days because they're being evaluated. It's called no, what do we do to kids? When we're constantly marking them, grading them, and demanding that they behave this way and that way, and they perform this and they perform that. Well, we're creating evaluation stress.
What should we be doing? How should we be monitoring them at school?
Again, if you go back to human evolution, how did kids learn in the first place? Did they sit in classrooms the whole day?
Explored.
They explored. They were outdoors with adults, under the benign supervision of adults. They played, free play. Now, free play is one of the essential needs of childhood. Our brains are wired for play. We have play circuits in our brains. Not only we do. Have you ever seen kittens or puppies or elephant cubs or lion cubs? They play. Why do they play? Because play is essential for healthy brain development. And play is far more important for healthy brain development and learning than academic instruction. So we would let our kids play, not with machines, but free play out in nature. And then they'd learn by watching us do things. Those kids will then develop a natural curiosity, which will make them want to learn about history or science or art, whatever they're interested in. So we get it backwards. We put the academic instruction and evaluation ahead of the child's spontaneous development.
We both have daughters who are just starting at high school.
Yeah.
So they're now starting to see the world of social media, the world of celebrity.
Yeah.
What's that doing to their self-esteem?
It depends on how well they connected are to the parents. If the primary connection is with the parents, then they're not going to be dependent on what their peers think of them. I mean, it might matter to them, but they're not going to be dependent on it. But there's a book that I helped to write, it's called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. It's been published here in the UK as well, and in 40 other languages. It's not my work. It's the work of a psychologist friend of mine called Gordon Neufeld. I did the writing with him because he's not a writer. But it's about the fact that in this society, kids get too hooked into each other way too early, and now they get their cues on how to be and how to walk and how to talk and what's important from each other, including they get the sense of value from peer evaluation and peer acceptance, which means now immature creatures now have enormous influence on each other's development, which is not how nature intended it.
There's so much of what I'm hearing as a subtext here, Gabor, around the three things that you spoke about that often trigger trauma for us, which is the sense of uncertainty, conflict, and the lack of control.
Yeah.
Would you expand on those for us?
Yeah, these don't trigger trauma, they trigger stress.
Stress.
Yeah. So this is the research literature that says that lack of information, uncertainty, conflict, loss of control trigger the body's stress apparatus, which means that there's more inflammation, there's higher levels of stress hormones, and there are damaging effects on the body. So I'll give you an example. They take, unfortunately, in laboratories, they can do terrible things to animals. So I'm not saying this with any sense of approval. I'm just telling you one study that I read. They took pairs of rats that were yoked together, and attached to their tail was an electrode, which delivers an electric shock. And both rats got the same degree of shock for the same duration of time. But one of them had a paw free that could turn off a lever that stopped the electrical shock. Then they measured their stress hormone levels. Those rats that had the freedom to turn off the lever had lower stress in their bodies than the ones who received the shock, the same shock for the same period of time, but had no control. So loss of control is a major source of stress. Now in this society, where a lot of the large decisions are made far away by people you don't even know, but they affect your life. You know, like some corporate, Elon Musk decides to fire half the people that worked for Twitter, which he did his first day on the job. Well, what do those people feel? Some guy who doesn't even know them makes a decision about their lives. No, that's the system we got. But I'm saying that it's the nature of the system to impose a lot of loss of control on people. In Britain right now, I've been reading the papers, there's this debate about cutting off financial help for heating in the wintertime.
The winter fuel payments,
You know, those people have no control whatsoever.
Yep.
Somebody in Parliament, and Keith Starmer is urging his MPs to vote for this cut because we need to save those 20 million or whatever pounds. Now, we're not going to do that by taxing the rich. We're going to do it by taking it from the poorest. How do those people feel? Quite apart from the cold they're going to experience, how do they feel about the loss of control in their lives? You know, and that's just one small example. And that they're going to get triggered. They're not just going to be cold if they can't afford the heating. Even if they can afford it, they're going to be triggered by minimally by taking by depriving themselves somewhere else.
Yep.
But the loss of control, we're just pawns in somebody else's game. It's tremendous in this society.
And this is where our own, I guess, mental strength comes to the fore. And one of your most shared and repeated quotes is, we may not be responsible for the world that created our minds, but we can take responsibility for the mind which creates our world.
Yeah.
How do we go about doing that?
Well, yeah, that's the whole thing. That's the key. And the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, basically, I'm paraphrasing him, that it's with our minds and our thoughts that we create the world that we live in. So, if you live in a world where if you say no, you're going to get rejected, and you can't handle that, that's very different than if you lived in a world where it's okay for me to say no. You're creating the world with your mind. You're creating your relationships and your life with these mind programs that was developed very early in childhood. So now you're not responsible for that mindset. I'm not responsible for my sense of abandonment. That was my first experience, early experiences in life. But I can be responsible for the mind that holds those beliefs. And I can recognize that these beliefs were programmed into me. They're not serving me anymore. I don't have to hold on to them. So that's what I mean there. It's very simple. It just means, no, it's not simple at all. Conceptually, it's simple.
Yeah.
But it means that we don't have to be programmed and limited and predetermined by beliefs and mind states that we developed when we were kids and we had no choice in the matter. We don't have to be.
So what would you say is the most effective way if somebody recognises they have an unhelpful belief system?
Yeah.
What's the most effective way anyone can start to rewire it?
Well, that is the first big step, is just to recognize it. Because until you recognize it, you actually think it's reality. And you think it's the only way reality can function. Once you realize that this is just a mindset, now you can do all kinds of things. But the first thing is to keep recognizing every time that mindset shows up in your life. So in my relationship with my wife, if I find her not as interested in me as I might want her to be, I can either indulge in self-pity and see myself as a victim and being abandoned, or I can notice, oh, I got the same stuff happening again. That's curious, what's going on? So I can get curious about it. Turns out it's got nothing to do with her rejecting me, it's just got to do with, she's got something else on her mind, you know? So just by noticing these habitual reactions, we developed the capacity to see ourselves a little bit from the outside and not be dominated by these old mind states. That's the beginning of it.
But to believe that we can change those mind states, we need hope, right?
It's more than hope. Almost anybody that I meet, almost anybody, if I question them, they'll be able to give me some example of where they used to believe something and that belief caused them grief. Then they saw through that belief and now they don't have that. I mean, almost, can you guys think of examples in your life of that? Can you not?
Yeah.
Where you had certain beliefs.
But I also know people who will listen to this and think, well, I'm so broken, I can't be helped.
Yeah, and I would say to them, I understand, and that belief itself is a belief. That belief itself is a mindset. And it refers to a time in your life when you were truly helpless, and you're truly alone, and truly vulnerable. Is that really true? Is it true that you can't ask for help? Is it true that there's nobody out there who can possibly understand you? Is that actually true? In other words, I would take that belief itself, that they're hopeless. And by the way, nobody's broken. There's nobody broken. We talked about this conversation began with this idea of wholeness. We're all born whole. And that wholeness is health. That can be refound in everybody. So nobody's damaged goods, nobody's broken. As long as they have consciousness, there's plenty of stuff to work with. That's not my assumption, that's what I know.
We've reached the point where we're going to offer you some quick fire questions.
Sure.
This first one might be a hard one to answer quick fire, but having listened to this really interesting chat, what's the first thing that you would like people to do if they're interested in changing their mindset? Where do we begin?
Read my damn book.
It's a great ad.
What's the first thing I want to start questioning themselves? Don't take it for granted. Don't take your belief for granted.
What's the greatest piece of advice you've ever received and why?
You know, when I was a family physician, I had this urge to write. And I used to have a patient, a great Canadian poet called Warren Tallman. And Warren would come in and I'd look after his medical needs and they would sit down and talk. And at one point I said to Warren, I want to write. I was in my 40s or maybe early 50s. And I was really frustrated and there was something in me that had a sense that I hadn't fully expressed myself, I haven't reached my potential yet. And I said to him, Warren, I want to write, but I don't know what. And he said, Gabor, you will write when you have something to teach the world. And that's the best thing anybody ever said to me, because that's actually what happened. So the advice was really trust yourself.
You've written so many popular books. You've been on the world's biggest podcasts. You've worked with some of the most famous people on the planet.
Yeah.
What are we still failing to understand about ourselves that is holding so many people back?
That we're born whole and that wholeness can be regained. That's been the theme of our conversation today, but that's the biggest one.
Great.
What advice would you give to a young Gabor just starting out on that journey from Hungary to Canada?
What advice would I give to myself? First of all, respect yourself, but never take yourself too seriously. And you don't have to do it all. And look more inside than to the outside. Because I used to look just to the outside all the time. And looking at myself was a long and difficult process. So I'd say, I also say, just don't take it so seriously. Just lighten up.
What's your biggest strength? What's your greatest weakness?
How can you look at me and ask if I have any weaknesses? Come on.
I thought it was a silly question.
My biggest strength is my capacity to see connections between things in a way that a lot of people can't. That really is a strength, and to be able to communicate that. My biggest weakness, I'm still concerned about who I'll be when I won't be able to do all the things I can do now. Like, who will I be then when I'm not out there on the podcasts and on the book circuit and talking and so on, then who will I be? So my biggest weakness or biggest concern you might be is just still, who am I when I'm not all that? I can talk about it, but if I examine myself honestly, it's a concern of mine.
And the truth is, one day you'll have to find out.
Eventually I'll find out.
If you could go back to one moment of your life, what would it be and why?
It'd be, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but there's certain decisions I made in my personal life that I would not make again, that I would make totally different choices. Choices that created a lot of suffering for people that I really love. That's what I'd like to go back to.
And without going into detail, obviously, from those, how have you learned to live with them?
By doing what repair I could, but also by forgiving myself, by recognizing that that's who I was, that's how I was programmed. I did what I did out of what I believed at that time. So there's no point keeping berating myself. The thing is to own it and take responsibility without allowing that to diminish my respect for myself.
And the final question that you want to leave ringing in the ears of our audience, your one golden rule, if you like, to living a high-performance life.
Trust yourself. Trust yourself. Really trust yourself. Not your ideas, but your true self. Just trust that it's there. Let it guide you. Because high performance is obviously different for everybody. And for me, it's, have I done the best I can with what I understand and what I know and what my calling is? Maybe that's too many words. Follow your calling. That's what I would say to people.
Gabor, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.